In Poland, the post-war period did not close the camps with silence. It turned them into courts and gallows. In Gdansk, a Polish Soviet special court judged in 1946 part of the staff from the Stutthof camp, responsible for murders, beatings, hunger, and selections within the concentration camp system. The first trial took place between April 25th and May 31st, 1946, and ended with death sentences. The sentences were carried out on July 4th, 1946, on the Biskupia Gorka Hill, through short drop hanging in a public execution meant to display justice and warning. Among those sentenced were a group of female guards executed together: Jenny Wanda Bachmann, Ewa Paradis, Elizabeth Becker, Gerda Steinhoff, and Wanda Klaff. Jenny Wanda Bachmann. Born in Hamburg on May 30th, 1922, Jenny Wanda Bachmann was raised by her father, who was a medical worker, and the family did not always have much money since her mother was a housewife. Jenny was a normal child and dreamed of becoming an actress. After her studies, she tried to become a model and succeeded, as the young woman stood out for her beauty and style. Despite the outbreak of World War II, she continued participating in photo shoots for German magazines and also in various advertising agencies. But then, at some point in early 1944, something changed in Jenny Wanda Bachmann's life. She sacrificed her modeling career and answered the call of the SS, who were looking for women to work in concentration camps. At that time, Jenny was about 21 years old, and many believed that, beyond the money, she was attracted by the power of the position. She passed the interview with flying colors and was recommended for training as a camp supervisor. She was then sent to the Stutthof concentration camp, which held 110,000 Jews behind barbed wire fences, of whom 65,000 never managed to leave alive. The camp was staffed by SS guards, as well as Ukrainian collaborators and female guards, a total of 295 women. Stutthof had a large number of prisoners from different countries, and the conditions there were very harsh. Thousands of prisoners died of hunger and disease, and many died from the typhus epidemics that swept through the camp. However, Stutthof was also famous for having the beautiful spectre Jenny the supermodel. As soon as she arrived at her post, Jenny showed her most evil and brutal side. In addition to modeling, the young woman had a talent for cruelty and sadism. She was known for beating prisoners almost to death and then sending them to the gas chambers, torturing prisoners in different ways. And some of these actions even disturbed the other guards, who were afraid of that girl. Beautiful and fragile in appearance, but monstrous inside. When World War II was coming to an end, Jenny tried to escape justice and became one of the most sought-after war criminals. She managed to evade capture for a time thanks to her charm, which allowed her to receive help for several months. However, in May 1945, she was arrested while boarding a train in Gdansk. During the interrogation, she said that she had always treated the Stutthof prisoners well and that she had never killed or mistreated the inmates. She also said that she helped some who were suffering and even saved the lives of some convalescents. But the descriptions of her actions and her statements did not match the accusations and testimonies against her. She then tried to escape, using her charm. Every day, Jenny spoke with a prison guard who began to fall in love with her, and she almost managed to get the man to allow her to leave the cell for a few hours, but he had a last-minute change of heart. Jenny Bachmann had to listen to dozens of testimonies from prisoners and see documents that showed and portrayed her evil deeds. Her lawyer tried to argue that the woman was insane and therefore not criminally responsible. The expert evaluations did not support this claim. Jenny spent most of her time during the trial flirting with the guards and worrying more about her hair than about the crime she had committed while in the camp. When she was sentenced to death, she listened to the verdict calmly and without crying. However, the last words of her judicial case were that life is truly a great pleasure, and pleasure, as a rule, does not last long. On July 4th, 1946, early in the morning, Jenny Wanda Bachmann was taken to the scaffold on Biskupia Gorka Hill alongside Gerda Steinhoff and Ewa Paradis. Jenny was only 24 years old when she was hanged for several minutes in front of thousands of people, overwhelmed by the terrible beauty of the beautiful spectre of Stutthof. Ewa Paradis. Another of the infamous guards of Stutthof was Ewa Paradis, who had a terrible reputation among the prisoner population. Born on December 17, 1920, in Leborg, in the Weimar Republic, this woman has an unknown past. It is known that she was an ardent Nazi and that she arrived at Stutthof in August 1944 with the aforementioned recruitment of women. Her time in the camp was marked by her love for the whip and sadism towards the prisoners. A witness said about an incident where she ordered a group of female prisoners to strip in the freezing cold of winter and then soaked them with ice-cold water. If the women trembled or moved, Paradis would beat them. Ewer Paradis continued to abuse and beat the prisoners and was later transferred to the Bromberg Ost subcamp for a brief period until she was transferred back to the main Stutthof camp. But then, in April 1945, she took part in the brutal death marches where prisoners were forced to walk kilometers without food or rest from Stutthof to the Laurinburg concentration camp. During the last march, Ewer fled, suspecting she would be judged for her crimes, and attempted to hide for as long as possible in the areas around Gdansk, but she was eventually captured. During the trials, she did not try to defend herself, nor did she address the accusations against her. On July 4, 1946, after spending a year in complete isolation without interacting with her former fellow camp guards, she was taken to Biskupia Gorka Hill, where she was hanged with a knot in her throat, pulled by a moving truck. She was the last woman executed on that hill, and her body hung for several minutes until her death was officially declared. Becker was born into a German family living in Newtek, the free city of Danzig, Poland. In 1936, at the age of 13, she joined the League of German Girls, and in 1938 she began working as a cook in Danzig. In 1939, the Germans arrived in the city, and according to reports, Becker adapted successfully. In 1940, she began working as an office worker and, the following year, as an agricultural assistant. In 1944, Becker was summoned by the SS to serve in the camps and was sent to Stutthof with the rank of SS Aufseherin, meaning supervisor. She later worked in the Stutthof women's camp in SK3. There she personally selected women and children to send to the gas chambers. Her period of work was short, but she carried it out to the letter, sending thousands of Jews to their deaths. When the Allies entered Poland, Becker fled Stutthof and returned to her home in Neuteich. On April 13, 1945, she was arrested by the Polish police and imprisoned awaiting trial. The Stutthof trial began in Danzig on May 31, 1946, and unlike her fellow guards, Becker sent several letters to Polish President Bolesław Bierut requesting a pardon, claiming that her actions had not been as severe as those of Gerda Steinhoff or Jenny Wanda Bachmann. But her pleas went unanswered, and the government did not issue any pardon. There, on the hill of Gdansk, alongside the other guards, she was hanged by the neck. Unlike the other women, when she was hanged, her neck broke quickly, so she lost consciousness immediately and had the fastest death. Gerda Steinhoff. Gerda Steinhoff was born on January 29, 1922. She received a traditional education, and when she was a teenager, she worked on a farm near her home, but later, after leaving school, she worked in a bakery starting in 1939. After her adolescence, Gerda worked as a tram driver until 1944, the year she got married and had a son. The need for money led her to respond to the call for guards made by the SS in the main cities of the Reich, as many former guards had been recruited to the front to fight against the Allies. Despite this, Steinhoff was accepted and trained in Stutthof to join the staff at that camp. On October 1, 1944, Gerda Steinhoff became a block leader who had control over a group of guards and prisoners at Stutthof. In addition to maintaining order, her main task was to organize and carry out selections of prisoners to be sent to die in the gas chambers. The Nazis valued her horrific work, and she was promoted to SS supervisor and considered a high-ranking female guard with other women serving under her. On December 1, 1944, she was reassigned to the subcamp Bromberg Ost, where she received a medal for her services to the Reich, celebrating that Steinhoff had become infamous for being a brutal and savage supervisor who would whip and beat the prisoners. When the Allies entered Poland and the camps began to evacuate, Gerda took the opportunity to escape and return home, intending to seek refuge with her family. However, after capturing and interrogating other female guards, the Polish authorities tracked Steinhoff down on May 25, 1945. Gerda was interrogated and tried in the first trial alongside many other guards and SS personnel, and during the trial, many witnesses spoke about her actions in several subcamps. They described how brutal the beatings were and how she participated in the selections of prisoners sent to death. She was considered a sadist who would assault and abuse the prisoners at every opportunity, but what surprised the judges was that Steinhoff had been a guard for only about a year, and the young 24-year-old mother had as many accusations against her as other women who had worked there for 3 years. She was found guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to death. Gerda Steinhoff was imprisoned for a short period until July 4, 1946, when she was taken to Biskupia Gorka Hill in Gdansk, where she was mounted on a gallows and hanged by the neck with her face uncovered in front of an audience of 200,000 people. Wanda Klaff. Wanda Klaff was born with the surname Kalaczynski on March 6, 1922, in the free city of Danzig. Her family was of German descent and her father worked on the railroads. After finishing school at the age of 16 in 1938, she began working at a jam factory and remained there until 1942. At the age of 20, she married a man named Wooly Klaff and left her job to become a housewife for a brief period. But since the couple needed money, Wanda returned to work as a tram operator. In 1944, Wanda applied for an SS guard position and was sent to the SS school in Stutthof. She completed her training there with veteran guards and was sent to the Stutthof subcamp called Proust, which was located in a small nearby village. There she harassed and hurt the prisoners using a metal-tipped whip. On October 5, 1944, she was transferred to the Rusochin subcamp, located in the village of Ruson. This small subcamp incarcerated around 300 women who were forced to do forced labor. If a woman couldn't complete her work, the guards would beat her brutally. But as Soviet forces neared Stutthof and the camps were being evacuated, many Nazis took the opportunity to flee. Wanda Klaff used the evacuations in early 1945 as a way to escape the camp and try to evade justice. However, on June 11, 1945, she was arrested and detained in a Polish prison. The conditions in the prison were quite bad, and because of this, she became seriously ill with typhoid fever, but she survived and was able to stand trial. Wanda was accused of mistreating the prisoners, stripping them and brutally beating them daily. She admitted to her crimes during the trial and appeared incredibly satisfied with what she had done. She said, "I am very smart and very dedicated to my work in the camps. I beat at least 2 prisoners every day." It is not known why she admitted this, and it may have been a boast, as it would have been unlikely that the judges would have viewed her favorably with this admission. Wanda Klaff was sentenced to death in the Stutthof trials when she was only 24 years old. After the war, many authorities found it strange how such young women could become such beasts. On July 4, 1946, they took her from her cell to Biskupia Gorka, ordered her to climb into the back of a truck, placed a rope around her neck, and hanged her on the scaffold. Executions in Hamelin. In the British occupation zone, post-war justice also had a fixed location, Hamelin Prison, Hamelin, used by the British military government as an execution site from December 13, 1945. There, the sentences imposed by British military tribunals were carried out, including those from the Belsen trial held in Lüneburg, which judged personnel from Bergen-Belsen as well as individuals transferred from Auschwitz at the end of the war. The execution was carried out by hanging inside the prison, usually by the British executioner Albert Pierrepoint. On that first day of executions in Hamelin, several women convicted in the Bergen-Belsen trial were hanged. Among the guards executed together, Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Borman stood out, and their names became associated with that day as a symbol of the British judicial closure on the crimes of the camp system. Irma Grese. Irma Grese was one of the principal war criminals in the Bergen-Belsen trial held between September and December 1945. The survivors of the camps who testified after the war accused her of murders and torture, always using a whip and a pistol as well as her own hands. Irma Grese was known for letting her dogs pounce on prisoners to devour them, shooting female inmates dead in cold blood, torturing children, committing sexual abuse and delivering sadistic beatings with braided whips until causing the victims' deaths. For this reason, the prisoners called her the Beast of Belsen. Irma Grese would advance toward the prisoners with her undulating walk and swaying hips. The eyes of the 40,000 unfortunate women, mute and motionless, were fixed on her. She was of medium height, elegantly dressed, and had impeccably styled hair. The mortal terror inspired by her presence undoubtedly pleased and delighted her, for that young woman in her 20s was utterly devoid of compassion. With a steady hand, she chose her victims, not only from among the healthy, but also from among the sick, weak, and incapacitated. Those who, despite their hunger and hardships, still displayed a bit of their former physical beauty were the first to be selected. They constituted the special targets of Irma Gräse's attention. During the selections, the blonde angel of Belsen, as the press preferred to call her, wielded her whip liberally. She lashed out wherever she pleased, smiling at the contortions of pain and the blood spilled by her victims. Irma Gräse was arrested by the British authorities shortly after the liberation of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Although in her defense she denied the murders and stated that she only knew the fate of the prisoners from the prisoners' own accounts, she never renounced her Nazi ideology, and she could be heard singing SS hymns in her cell. At the Bergen-Belsen trial, she was sentenced to death by hanging at the age of 22, becoming the youngest woman sentenced to death in the 20th century. She was executed at Hamelin prison on December 13, 1945. It seems there was a confrontation with the famous English executioner Albert Pierrepoint. When he attempted to place a dark hood over the condemned woman, she violently refused. Pierrepoint slapped her repeatedly until he managed to subdue her. Gräse insulted the executioner and, while crying, shouted at him, "Quickly!" Those were her last words. Pierrepoint placed the noose around her neck, but in an improper manner. It is believed that, in reality, Gräse died by strangulation rather than hanging, suffering a slow, agonizing, and painful death. After her execution, her body was mutilated and cremated, and the ashes were then thrown into a drainage river. Elisabeth Volkenrath. On April 15, 1945, in the southwest of Nazi Germany at Bergen, the British 11th Armoured Division liberated Bergen-Belsen. Amid the horrifying scenes of 13,000 unburied corpses and nearly 60,000 prisoners, one of the infamous perpetrators of the criminal Nazi regime emerged: Elisabeth Volkenrath. The journey into darkness of this woman, who joined Nazism while still a child, and the horrors she committed, shocked the entire world. Elisabeth Volkenrath was born on September 5, 1919 in Hamelin as one of 6 children of a typical middle-class family. Her life took a dark turn in 1933 when Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party came to power, and Elisabeth, only 13 years old, joined the League of German Girls, the female counterpart of the Hitler Youth. These organizations were used to indoctrinate young minds with Nazi ideology, shaping their beliefs, thoughts, and actions. Elisabeth's early years were marked by her participation in this indoctrination. After primary school, she worked as a nanny, kitchen assistant, and in a hair salon, before being recruited by the SS in 1941 and sent to Ravensbrück. This camp housed more than 132,000 women, and Volkenrath received training as a guard under the direction of her infamous supervisor, Dorothea Binz. There, Volkenrath took part in the horrifying experiments carried out by SS doctors on prisoners, which involved breaking the victims' limbs, infecting wounds with bacteria, and testing various methods of bone placement and transplantation, all without anesthesia. In 1942, Volkenrath was transferred to Auschwitz, a place known for its sadism and brutality. There she participated in the cruel gas chamber selections like most female guards. She was known for her ruthless beatings and enjoyed making roll call as arduous as possible, forcing prisoners to remain motionless for hours with their arms raised, punishing them if they moved. However, her preferred task was the separation of families. As many prisoners arrived at the camps with their loved ones, Volkenrath was responsible for separating husbands from wives and parents from children, using perverse phrases that inflicted tremendous fear and psychological damage. In April 1945, after the liberation of the camp, she was finally captured by British forces and was required to appear before the court. During her testimony, she stated, "Living in the camps was truly horrible, but it was also terrible for the female guards. We were punished just like the prisoners." Volkenrath, as well as Irma Gräse, another guard, declared that they were forced by their superiors to be good Nazis, which meant showing no kind of empathy or kindness toward Jews. However, her unrepentant and ruthless conduct during the trial generated no sympathy among the judges. Elisabeth Volkenrath was sentenced to death by hanging, a sentence carried out on December 13, 1945. At 26 years of age, the young Nazi became the first female Nazi guard to be hanged by the neck among many others who would follow. The public, unflinching, did not shed a single tear for Volkenrath. Johanna Borman. Johanna Borman was born on September 10, 1893, in Birkenfeld, East Prussia. It is believed that during her early years she was deeply religious and had carried out missionary work. However noble her origins may have been, the career change she later pursued would certainly not be pious. Johanna's journey into evil began at the age of 45 in March 1938, when she joined the SS as a civilian employee, with the simple objective of earning more money. After this, she was sent to work in the kitchens of Lemberg, the first concentration camp for women. This camp would eventually change its purpose, and the female staff prisoners, including Bormann, were transferred to the Ravensbrück concentration camp near Berlin. There she was promoted to guard, but her career was only just beginning. Her harshness and violent character set her apart from the other female guards, and she was rewarded with the position of supervisor before being transferred to the Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland in May 1943, and a few months later to the Birkenau extermination camp. She first worked in the external command, which operated around the camp, but later she would assume duties within Birkenau. Johanna Borman received several nicknames that would cement her legacy as one of the true monsters of the Holocaust. Prisoners called her the Weasel of Auschwitz because of her face and cruelty, or even the Bitch of Belsen. There were numerous accusations regarding Bormann's brutality, and it was known that she was one of the most hated members of the staff throughout the entire camp. Although she was a small and slender woman, she was full of aggressiveness and barbarity. She routinely beat and abused prisoners, enjoying every second. Johanna took pleasure in pointing out prisoners during the selection processes to none other than Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death. Selection was the most feared part of the day, during which prisoners were forced to stand naked for hours before Johanna decided whether they would continue working in the camp, be sent with the cruel Mengele, or be sent directly to the gas chamber. However, her main nickname, the Bitch of Belsen, stemmed from her fascination with setting German shepherds upon prisoners, enjoying watching them tear the victims apart. During the liberation, Bormann was arrested and forced to confront many of the cruelties within the camp during her trial. Throughout the trial, she remained quite defiant and made a series of statements, such as claiming that she only sought to maintain order within Auschwitz, which was why she beat prisoners, although she categorically denied her participation in the selection processes for the gas chambers. She also admitted to having German shepherds at her home and bringing them into the camp, but rejected the accusations regarding the attacks, since, according to her, this would have been against camp rules and she would have been punished. It was also revealed that she allegedly attempted to leave the SS in 1943. However, her request was rejected. Despite her defense, Johanna was found guilty of the charges against her and was sentenced to death by hanging. According to reports, she left the courtroom as if in a dreamlike trance and chose not to appeal her sentence. Bormann was transferred to Hamelin prison to await her execution. Bormann's execution was swift and followed those of Greta and Volkenrath. Ravensbrück. In the case of Ravensbrück, the executions were not concentrated in a single public act as in Gdansk, but were the staggered outcome of British military trials held in Hamburg between 1946 and 1948, known as the Hamburg-Ravensbrück trials. Several female guards received the death penalty for mistreatment, murder, and participation in selections, and the sentences were carried out by hanging at Hamelin prison, generally by the British executioner Albert Pierrepoint. Although some executions occurred on very close dates, they did not always coincide on the same day. Dorothea Binz was executed on May 2, 1947, Greta Bösel on May 3, 1947, and Ruth Neudeck on July 29, 1948, following the trial linked to the Uckermark subcamp. Ruth Neudeck. Ruth Closius Neudeck, better known by her married name Ruth Neudeck, was born on July 5, 1920 in Breslau, a German city that is now Rockwool, Poland. In documents from the period, she appears as a young woman without formal military rank, but integrated into the guard system that the concentration camp machinery needed to watch, discipline, and break tens of thousands of prisoners. That detail, the absence of a high-ranking state position, is precisely what made her story so disturbing. She was not a famous Nazi leader, but an operational piece who, in a few months, ended up sitting before a tribunal and later before a trapdoor. To understand how someone like Neudeck could become relevant in such a short time, one must look at the ecosystem in which she was absorbed. Ravensbrück, the large women's concentration camp of the Nazi system, operated from 1939 as a detention center and also as a node from which subcamps and labor assignments were administered. By January 1945, the complex held tens of thousands of prisoners. The military collapse of the Reich pushed evacuations, forced marches, and an increase in everyday brutality. In that world, female guards and supervisors existed for an administrative reason. The SS structure required women to guard women, and Ravensbrück was also a place where many received training before being dispatched to other destinations. Neudeck entered that universe in the final phase of the war. Available sources agree that she joined the Guard service in 1944, and that from the end of that year to the early months of 1945, her trajectory was concentrated in Ravensbrück and its immediate annexes. The chronology matters because her career as a guard was short but compressed. The front was collapsing, the camp was overcrowded, and the chain of command demanded rapid results in discipline and in the selection of those who no longer fit the logic of forced labor or the system's health control. Within Ravensbrück, Neudeck was not a decorative figure. Secondary documentation places her rising to barrack supervisory functions, a position that put the Guard in direct and constant contact with the prisoners. Counts, punishments, training, movement control, and the immediate power to decide who was beaten, who was reported, who was humiliated, or sent to more exhausting work. That power was small in the SS hierarchy, but enormous in the daily life of thousands of women who depended on a gesture to eat, rest, or survive another day. Neudeck's path becomes even darker when Uckermark appears, a sub-camp associated with Ravensbrück. Uckermark had been opened in 1942 as a camp for young women considered difficult by the regime, but in 1945 its function changed. In the final stage of the war, the site was used to concentrate and eliminate prisoners categorized as sick, exhausted, or unfit, and it was linked to selections for the gas chamber. In the series of post-war British trials, the Uckermark trial, the third trial within the so-called Hamburg-Ravensbrück trials, focused precisely on mistreatment, participation in selections, and the connection to that killing mechanism. In that trial, Ruth Neudeck was identified as the chief guard at that site and, according to the summary of proceedings, received a death sentence. The structure of the courts helps explain why the case proceeded so decisively. After the war, the British occupation zone conducted hundreds of trials for Nazi crimes. Hamburg, in particular, became between 1945 and 1949 a key center for trying camp personnel, with hearings at the Curio House and a military court model relying on investigations, survivor testimonies, and reconstruction of camp functions. Within that framework, female guards were not excluded simply for being women. In the early post-war trials, those who had committed direct violence with their own hands were prosecuted, and several were sentenced, including to death. What emerges then is the portrait of a 28-year-old woman, the age she was at her death, caught in a historical paradox, socially common, bureaucratically replaceable, yet linked to decisions and punishments that, in a camp, amounted to controlling life and death. And when the Reich fell, that same operational character became a judicial problem. Her defense could not hide behind a distant office or an abstract signature because the type of charges discussed in the camp trials relied primarily on what survivors claimed to have seen, suffered, and remembered. At the end of April 1945, when the Ravensbrück system began to unravel in evacuations and marches, the guards also fled or tried to blend in with the civilian population. Neudeck was captured and, following the British investigation, ended up in a trial that found her responsible for war crimes committed in the Ravensbrück-Uckermark complex. In the available biographical summary, she is listed as a defendant in the Ravensbrück trials held in the British zone, found guilty and sentenced to the gallows. The final scene of her story takes place far from the barbed wire, but within another type of closed architecture: Hamelin Prison. In the post-war period, Hamelin was used by the British military government as a site for executions. Dozens of hangings of war criminals took place there, and British executioner Albert Pierrepoint participated in a significant portion of those cases. Ruth Newdeck was executed on July 29, 1948, in that prison by hanging. Dorothea Binz. When speaking of Nazi female guards who ended up on the gallows, Dorothea Theodora Binz occupies a particular place. Due to her youth, the power she accumulated within the most emblematic women's camp of the system, and the way her name became associated with everyday fear rather than an isolated incident. Born on March 16, 1920, in the Brandenburg region, Binz arrived at Ravensbrück in the early stages of the war, when the camp, opened in 1939, was beginning to expand from its initial core into a huge complex of forced labor, discipline, and extermination. Ravensbrück was not just a women's concentration camp, it also functioned as a hub for personnel training and distribution. Thousands of women were trained there as guards or Officerinnen and then sent to other camps in the Reich. In that context, Binz was neither a decorative figure nor a minor official. Over time, she came to be presented as assistant to the head of guards, a rank that, in practice, gave her the authority to order routines, impose punishments, decide labor assignments, and shape the behavior of other guards. The paradox later emphasized by researchers and survivors was twofold. On one hand, the Nazi regime was radically patriarchal. On the other, the daily administration at Ravensbrück largely depended on these female auxiliaries who could not formally belong to the SS but acted within its machinery and under its authority. Accounts of her rise place her first in less visible tasks and then quickly in spaces where violence was the normal language. She is described as working in sectors such as the kitchen or laundry, and later connected to confinement and punishment areas, particularly the cell blocks and the bunker, a place where prisoners could be isolated, beaten, interrogated, or broken away from the eyes of the barracks. By the early 1940s, she already held supervisory positions. By 1944, her promotion to stellvertretende Oberaufseherin, or deputy head of guards, placed her as a central figure, responsible even for training and assigning tasks to dozens of guards at a time. Real power in a camp was not measured only by rank, but by the freedom to exercise cruelty without consequences. In later testimonies, Binz appears as someone who needed no reason. She chose the weakest, the most frightened, the slow walkers, and turned that vulnerability into permission to strike. There are descriptions of whipping, kicking, slapping, shootings, dogs used as intimidation or attack tools, and a presence that paralyzed the roll call yard. It was enough for her to enter the Appellplatz for silence to become tangible, as if the very air remembered what happened when someone drew her attention. At Ravensbrück, moreover, violence was not only punishment, it was administration. The camp became massive and overcrowded as the war progressed. Diseases and malnutrition increased. The demand for production for the war economy extended working hours and lowered the utility threshold for each body. In that context, the guard who combined discipline with terror became functional. Binz, according to several accounts, was an instructor of that pedagogy. New guards quickly learned what was rewarded, tolerated, and celebrated. Brutality, instead of being hidden, became a method. There is also an element present in many perpetrator stories, the intimate normalization of crime. It is mentioned that Binz had a relationship with an SS officer, Edmund Breuning, and as a couple they could stroll around the camp perimeter while watching punishments, as if the scene were part of the landscape. This is not a romantic detail, it is a window into how violence ceased to be work and became entertainment, a trait that survivors and chroniclers recorded with disgust, because it turned the suffering of others into a backdrop for private life. The collapse of the Reich brought Ravensbrück to its final phase: evacuations, death marches, and dispersal. Binz left the camp in that chaos, but she did not vanish. She was captured by British forces in Hamburg on May 3, 1945, as the post-war period began transforming the hunt for perpetrators into files, interrogations, and tribunals. The so-called First Ravensbrück trial began on December 5, 1946, and concluded on February 3, 1947. 16 camp staff and collaborators were seated there. Binz was 26 years old when tried, and she no longer appeared as an ordinary guard, but as a command element. The trial placed her among those who had exercised direct violence and also among those who had supported, organized, or amplified the system. In modern journalistic reconstructions, her crimes are summarized in brutally direct terms: shooting, whipping, using dogs against prisoners. The sentence was death. And here the chronology matters. It is often thought that the trials were a single wave, but in reality they were successive layers. In Binz's case, the conviction from the first British trial connected to a series of executions concentrated at Hamelin, a prison converted into a site of hangings for war criminals under British administration. The mechanics were cold and repetitive: lists, confirmations, transfers, and a gallows that functioned as the administrative closure of human files. In April 1947, when her sentence was confirmed, Binz attempted suicide by cutting her wrists, but she was saved in time. That gesture did not make her a victim. It showed another face of the same logic she had administered, the attempt to regain control over the last available second. The execution proceeded. On May 2, 1947, Dorothea Binz was hanged at Hamelin prison. Various reconstructions indicate that the executioner was Albert Pierrepoint, the British hangman who participated in multiple executions of war criminals during that period. In the final sequence, all that had been shouting, orders, whips, and threats was reduced to a hallway, a procedure, and a trapdoor, and her name moved from the command registry at Ravensbrück to the execution record in occupied Germany. Greta Bösel. Greta Bösel was born on May 9, 1908, in Wuppertal-Elberfeld in Imperial Germany. Before becoming a figure pursued by post-war tribunals, her life seemed to fit an ordinary profile. She trained as a nurse, a profession associated with care, discipline, and institutional obedience. That contrast, the contrast of a woman trained to assist bodies who ends up administering a system designed to destroy them, is one of the keys to understanding her case. Her entry into the concentration camp world came late, when the Nazi machinery was already well-oiled and the Reich was beginning to collapse. According to biographical records compiled after the war, Bösel joined the Ravensbrück complex in August 1944 as a guard. Ravensbrück, the large concentration camp primarily for women, was also a center for administering forced labor, assignments, roll calls, punishments for low performance, and a constant flow of prisoners weakened by hunger, disease, and endless workdays. In this context, decisive power was not always wielded by the person holding the highest rank, but by the one controlling the work. Who left the barracks, who was sent to a particular commando, who stayed in line, who was marked as unfit. This was exactly where Bösel gained influence. At Ravensbrück, her role was that of Arbeitseinsatzführerin, roughly chief of labor assignment, a role linked to the camp's work office, with authority to organize large contingents of prisoners into work details, distribute tasks, and above all, exert pressure through fear. In the Nazi system, work was not a means of survival, it was a method of slow control and extermination. The boundary between exploitation and killing shifted daily, and those managing the work lists were in the perfect position to push someone toward ultimate exhaustion. In the fall and winter of 1944, that boundary became even more brutal. With the front approaching and the system overwhelmed, selections intensified. Administrative decisions separating those who could still be exploited from those considered a burden due to illness, weakness, or age. Sources summarizing her actions indicate that by November 1944, Bösel was involved in selections for the gas chamber or transfers to the Uckermark area, associated in the war's final phase with the elimination of unfit prisoners. A phrase often attributed to her condenses this logic with chilling coldness. If they can't work, let them rot. When the collapse came, many staff members tried to disappear using the same method they had always relied on: confusion. After the evacuations and forced marches accompanying the end of Ravensbrück, Bösel fled with her husband. But the post-war world was already assembling a different kind of machinery, a judicial one. She was captured by British troops and placed at the disposal of the occupying authority. Bösel appeared on the dock alongside other Ravensbrück staff members, including Deputy Chief Dorothea Binz. The British tribunal found her guilty. Available summaries of the verdict specifically mention mistreatment, murder, and participation in selections. This was no minor charge. In the post-war legal logic, the word selection meant active collaboration with a death mechanism, because separating the fit from the unfit was neither medicine nor discipline. It was deciding who would be sent to elimination. The sentence was death. And the end took place in a location made sinister by repetition. Hamelin prison, used by the British authorities to execute convicted war criminals. Many executions of this period were carried out by British executioner Albert Pierrepoint. In Bösel's case, sources summarizing her execution identify him as the executioner. Regarding the exact date, there is a slight discrepancy in references. Some record May 2nd, 1947, and others May 3rd, 1947, both in Hamelin, by hanging. British records even specify an exact time, 9:55 a.m., placing her within a sequence of executions carried out that day in the same prison. In any case, the essential fact remains her case ended with a rope, not a commutation, and her name was archived among the women of the concentration camp system who were condemned and executed for war crimes. Hermine Braunsteiner. In this list, Hermine Braunsteiner is a particular case for one concrete reason: she was not executed. Unlike other supervisors who ended up on the gallows after the war, she went through a longer path made of silences, identity changes, domestic life in the United States, historical extradition, and a never-ending trial in West Germany that only decades later led to a life sentence. Hermine Braunsteiner Ryan was born in Vienna on July 16, 1919, into a working-class Catholic family, and she died on April 19, 1999, in Bochum, Germany. Her early biography, like that of many minor cogs in the Nazi apparatus, did not anticipate a fate of judicial files, modest jobs, the frustrated desire to become a nurse, and the pursuit of a better salary. That economic detail appears as a key threshold. According to biographical reconstructions, she learned that the newly created Ravensbrück camp offered positions for women as supervisors with a much higher income than she had, and she began her training there on August 15, 1939. On October 16, 1942, she was assigned to the Majdanek complex near Lublin in occupied Poland, where she worked connected to a clothing factory and the prisoner surveillance circuit. Majdanek combined forced labor with mass murder. It was a place where overcrowding, selection, punishment, and death formed a single logistical system. In the testimonies that would accumulate decades later, Braunsteiner appears as a figure of direct violence, associated with beatings and particularly brutal assaults to the point of earning a nickname that crossed languages, the Mare of Majdanek or the Stomping Mare, due to the way survivors described her attacking prisoners with her boots. The image left by these statements is not that of a distant bureaucrat, but of a guard who participated on the front lines of terror. In 1943, she received the War Merit Cross, second class, an indication that the Nazi state saw her performance as valuable within the repressive economy of the camp. By early 1944, when evacuations and rearrangements began to shake the system due to the advancing front, she was sent again to the Ravensbrück complex and then linked to the subcamp of Gentin, where witnesses reported new episodes of abuse and punishments with whips or straps. With the end of the war, like many camp staff members, she disappeared into the chaos. And there begins Hermine Braunsteiner's second life, that of a woman who managed to go off the radar, rebuild herself in another country, and maintain for years a domestic normality that clashed with what survivors remembered. In the United States, she lived as a housewife in Queens, New York, under her husband's surname, Ryan, and when a journalist or investigator located her, her first phrase was recorded as a crack in the facade. "My God, I knew this would happen. You came." This discovery was more than a media case. It opened an institutional door. The pursuit of Nazi criminals in the United States existed, but its capacity was irregular and depended on political will, evidence, and public pressure. The Braunsteiner-Ryan case pushed a change of era, revocation of citizenship, immigration proceedings, and finally the construction of a more systematic policy. In fact, her case is mentioned as a precedent for the creation in 1979 of the Office of Special Investigations of the Department of Justice, aimed at locating and prosecuting Nazis living in the country through denaturalization and deportation. The legal dimension of her downfall has an exact date and a key document. On May 1, 1973, a federal judge in the Eastern District of New York certified her extradition within the framework of the case In re Ryan, a case that today can be read as a milestone, the file of a former camp guard turned fugitive requested by the Federal Republic of Germany. And on August 7, 1973, Hermine Braunsteiner Ryan became the first Nazi criminal extradited from the United States to West Germany. Back in Germany, the fate that awaited her was the core of one of the longest trials in the country's judicial history, the so-called Third Reich trial in Düsseldorf. It began on November 26, 1975, and extended over 474 hearings. It was described as the longest and most expensive trial in post-war West Germany. The Jewish Museum in Berlin, reviewing the major German proceedings against Auschwitz and Majdanek personnel, highlights precisely this dimension: years of testimonies, social frictions, political tensions, and a country still debating how to confront its own past without protecting perpetrators. In court, survivors recounted scenes that for many were impossible to hear without feeling time bend. They were not remembering. They were reliving in front of those who had exercised absolute power over their bodies. Records on Braunsteiner include testimonies of mistreatment, beatings, the way people were selected or pushed onto trucks going to death. During the trial, she was at times described as showing no visible remorse, as if the courtroom were a formality, a scene also reflected in contemporary accounts of the trial. The sentence arrived on June 30, 1981. On that day, the Düsseldorf court imposed a life sentence on Braunsteiner, while other defendants received significantly lesser sentences or were acquitted due to insufficient evidence. What was relevant, beyond the number, was the implicit message. Even decades later, and even with the enormous evidentiary limitations of mass crimes, German justice could affirm individual responsibility within a system designed to dilute guilt. According to the case summary, the conviction relied on charges of murder and complicity in multiple murders, including involvement in acts linked to children. And yet, the outcome again differentiates her from the executed guards. Braunsteiner did not end up on the Hamelin scaffold. Her health deteriorated. She suffered from diabetes with severe complications, including the amputation of a leg, and in 1996, she was released from prison for medical reasons. 3 years later, on April 19, 1999, she died in Bochum, Germany. Elsa Ehrich. Elsa Lieschen Frieda Ehrich, known in many records as Elsa Ehrich, was born on March 8, 1914 in Bredereiche, in the then Grand Duchy of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Her story is different from that of several Ravensbrück guards tried by the British in Hamburg and executed in Hamelin. Erich's end occurred in Poland after a Polish judicial process related to Majdanek and ended with a precise date that fixed her permanently in post-war records, October 26, 1948, hanged in Lublin. To understand why her name is associated with the harshest core of the concentration camp system, one must look at the place where she reached her greatest power. Majdanek, the concentration and extermination camp in Lublin, operated between 1941 and 1944 as a hybrid complex. Forced labor, mass imprisonment, executions, and industrial-scale killings, with logistics like a factory and violence as a tool of daily administration. After the area was liberated by the Red Army in 1944, Majdanek also became an immediate symbol, as it was one of the first large camps whose material evidence was accessible to investigations and shortly afterward to courts. Ehrich entered this system not as a desk figure but as a camp guard. Biographical summaries agree that she served as a female guard at several locations including Kraków-Płaszów and, most importantly, Majdanek. What makes her pivotal is her functional rank. She was Oberaufseherin, a senior supervisor of the female sector. In the camps, this title was not ceremonial. It meant supervising other guards, controlling routines, imposing discipline, organizing formations, and, most decisively, participating in administrative decisions that separated who continued and who disappeared in a system where disappearing too often meant being sent to death. At Majdanek, the women's and children's sector was part of a mechanism that did not merely confine, it classified. Counts, lists, and selections formed a control technology. The word selection had a bureaucratic appearance, but in the camps it meant deciding the fate of a human being with a signal, gesture, or order. Biographical records describe Ehrich as actively participating in the major selections that sent prisoners to the gas chambers or executions. This was the core of what, years later, judges would consider criminal responsibility. Her role became even more significant due to the context in which Majdanek was judged. Unlike other trials concentrated in occupied Germany under Allied jurisdiction, the Majdanek trials were a long and dispersed sequence, held both in Poland and Germany over decades. Within this series, there were a set of Polish trials between 1946 and 1948, sometimes called the Second Majdanek Trial, in which personnel captured or identified as part of the camp were judged. There, Ehrich appears cited as one of the most prominent defendants due to her role as supervisor of the women's and children's sector, and in that series, she received one of the harshest sentences: death. The contrast with other guards executed in 1947 or 1948 in Germany is useful for understanding the judicial climate. In the British courts, many cases relied on survivor testimony, command structures in German camps, and the political urgency to close chapters. In Poland, in addition to that, there was an immediate component. The camp was there, the memory was close, and the post-war period was experienced as a still open present. The Polish trials were not just punishment, they were a way to establish a legal record of crimes committed in occupied territory before a society that had been one of the main stages of the extermination. In available summaries, Ehrich is defined as convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity related to her actions at Majdanek. Her case is not based on guilt by membership, but on active participation within a killing system. The rank of Oberaufseherin implied authority. Authority implied decision-making capacity, and decision-making capacity within that environment translated into direct consequences over the lives and deaths of prisoners. It is also significant where she is placed in the camp's chronology. Majdanek had its most intense period of operation before July 1944, and subsequent trials tried to reconstruct who were the actors sustaining the internal regime during that period. In these reconstructions, the guard personnel were not a minor detail. They were the daily layer of violence, converting general orders into concrete actions. A supervisor of the female sector did not just pass through. She operated where terror was routine and where every roll call, punishment, and selection was part of the same procedure. In some secondary accounts, specific episodes have been added, such as the mention of an attempt to organize a brothel within the camp system. However, such details tend to circulate more in summaries and compilations and generally require primary documentation for precise substantiation. What remains as the backbone of the case is her supervisory role and participation in selections linked to mass killings. After being tried in Lublin in the framework of the Majdanek trials, Elsa Ehrich was sentenced to death and executed by hanging on October 26, 1948 in Lublin in post-war Poland. Martha Ullmann. When one investigates the female guards of the camps, one usually starts from an assumption that the name appearing on a list corresponds to a perpetrator, someone who wore a uniform, wielded authority, and participated in the concentration camp system from the side of power. With Martha Ullmann, however, something different happens. The public and verifiable documentary trail that appears under that name does not lead to a Nazi guard executed, but to a Jewish woman turned forced laborer in Berlin and ultimately deported to Auschwitz, where she was murdered. The most solid clue does not come from a post-war judicial file, a verdict, or a service photograph in a camp. It comes from a bronze plaque embedded in a sidewalk, a Stolperstein, those stumbling stones that return names to everyday space. In the Berlin district of Charlottenburg-Wilmersdorf, at Bruchsaler Straße 6, a Stolperstein was placed with the inscription, "Here lies Martha Ullmann, deported and died in Auschwitz." The installation is dated June 2, 2021. That stone does not commemorate her as an agent of terror, but as a target of terror. According to the biographical reconstruction published by the Berlin District Administration, Martha Ullmann was born on January 12, 1887, in Würzburg. She was unmarried and had no children. When she arrived in Berlin and why was not precisely established. What does appear clearly is the last stretch of her life, forced labor. Ullmann was employed as a Zwangsarbeiterin, a forced laborer, at the company Krone Presswerk AG, located at Frankfurter Allee 288 in the Lichtenberg district. At that stage, her name was no longer that of a citizen with rights, but that of a person controlled by regulations, surveillance, and punishment. A solitary woman trapped in a capital that had turned survival into a labyrinth. About 90 Jewish workers and around 500 foreign forced laborers worked there, and part of the non-German labor force was housed in a barracks called Revo, a camp for civilian forced workers. That transition for Martha Ullmann came with an operation that, in its mechanics, seems designed to erase any trace of intimacy, the so-called fabric action. At the end of February and beginning of March 1943, the Gestapo organized raids in factories and workshops to arrest the last Jews still working as forced laborers in companies considered important for the war. It was not a street detention, it was arrest at the workplace during working hours in front of machines, foremen and co-workers, a surgical strike to eliminate this last margin of existence at once. The Berlin Memorial page notes that Martha Ullmann was arrested in that operation, abgeholt at her workstation. After the arrest, the route followed a pattern repeated thousands of times, transfer to a temporary collection point, a Sammelage, a funnel. In Ullmann's case, she was taken to the synagogue at Levetzowstrasse 7-8, a building severely damaged during Kristallnacht and reused by the regime as a temporary detention site. There, a religious space turned human storage. Lists, counts, weights and orders were chained together while the next step was prepared, the train. On March 4, 1943, Martha Ullmann was deported with the so-called 34th Osttransport to Auschwitz. 1,141 more people traveled on that transport. It was not a transfer to the east in a neutral geographic sense. It was the bureaucratic language used to name a mechanism of extermination. Later, Ullmann was murdered in Auschwitz, but no exact date of death is known. An executed Nazi guard usually leaves a judicial trail, charges, testimonies, verdicts, dates, and sometimes even press photos. Martha Ullmann, in contrast, leaves a commemorative and documentary trail typical of a victim, an address, a plaque, forced labor, arrest during the fabric action, a numbered transport, an end without a precise day. The name itself may appear on confusing or incomplete lists, but the accessible and verifiable record in this case does not place her on the side of perpetrators, but on the side of those crushed by the system. And yet her story is not outside the general narrative. To understand the Guards, one must look at the other end of the chain, how people lived, where they were, and what real margin of defense someone like Martha Ullmann had in 1943. The machinery that allowed a woman to be taken from her workplace and sent to Auschwitz in a matter of days was the same machinery that gave power to other women within the concentration camp universe. Regulations, hierarchies, uniforms, lists, punishments, transports, human categories that decided who ate, who worked, who was beaten, and who disappeared.